Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's May 1st, and I'm back from spending a week at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Neurology, where we heard lots of announcements and news, and we talked about a lot of that news as it was being made during last week's podcast. And if you missed last week's podcast episode, I'm going to suggest that you give it a listen when you can, because one of the bigger pieces of news coming out of the American Academy of Neurology was a new set of guidelines for treating MS. They updated the guidelines for when you should begin using MS disease-modifying drugs, how you should go about switching from one MS prescription medication to another, and how you should go about stopping MS disease-modifying therapy. Now, obviously, these are all things that you should discuss with your neurologist, but I'm a big believer in being an informed medical consumer, so that when you have that conversation with your neurologist, it can really be a two-way conversation. Not only did we talk about this in last week's podcast episode, but I also put a link to those guidelines themselves into last week's show notes. And speaking of those show notes, I'd like to thank all of you who asked me to be more detailed in my show notes. I think of this podcast as a conversation between us. So when you email your thoughts and suggestions, I always try to respond. And several of you requested that I include links to the things that we talk about every week. So a couple of weeks ago, I started including those links and other details into each podcast episode's show notes. And by the way, I know that not every podcast app allows you to access those live links. So just keep in mind that you can always find each episode's complete show notes with all the live links to everything we talk about at realtalkms.com. And thanks again for sharing your feedback and your suggestions with me. I have some really great news to share for those of you who have an Amazon Alexa-enabled device at home. As of today, the Real Talk MS podcast has its own Alexa skill that you can access through your Amazon Echo, Dot, or any Alexa-enabled device. So what does this mean? All you have to do is say, Alexa, enable the Real Talk MS podcast. And from then on, you'll be able to listen to our latest podcast episode. You'll be able to easily navigate to any past episode. You'll be able to fast forward and rewind within each podcast episode, and you'll even be able to pause the podcast, come back later, and pick up exactly where you left off. You can check out all of the details for the Real Talk MS Alexa skill by going to the Amazon Alexa app and searching for MS. I'm going to be looking at voice-enabled devices in an upcoming episode of the podcast because I think that while they bring just a tremendous amount of extra convenience into any home, I think that if you're living with a disability, these devices can be real game changers. When my wife Jean was diagnosed with MS, her first and what became her worst symptom was a tremor that began in her pinky finger, but ended up in both arms, hands, and her head. It made it impossible for her to use a mouse, or a keyboard, or a phone. Someone like Jean would have no way of easily listening to our podcast, yet I do this podcast exactly for someone like Jean. An Amazon Echo can make all the difference if you're dealing with tremor or vision issues, or if for any reason it's a challenge for you to access the podcast or music or news and weather. And you can also use your Amazon Echo to control other connected things in your home, like your smart TV and even your lights. besides being merely convenient, I really think of the Echo as an accessibility device, and it's something you might want to check out. I'll be including a link to more information in today's show notes. I should also mention that you'll be able to access the RealTalk MS podcast Alexa skill anywhere in the U.S. as of today. It's coming to Canada very shortly, and it'll be rolled out in additional countries around the world before the end of the year. And I also want to sincerely thank all of the wizards at Amazon who helped bring the RealTalk MS Alexa skill to life. And I especially want to thank Rob Walsh and the team at Libsyn, my podcast media hosting company, for putting up with what I'll call my energetic exuberance while making this possible. If you're a RealTalk MS listener, you never have to think about media hosting companies, but those are the companies that provide the necessary infrastructure so that you can find your favorite podcast and listen to it easily. And almost every day, I'm reminded of why, after doing my due diligence, I originally chose Libsyn as my media hosting company, and why I still consider them to be the very best in the business. Well, my guest on today's podcast is Dr. Matthew Miles, the Chief Executive Officer of MS Research Australia. And MS Research Australia is the largest nonprofit organization dedicated to funding, coordinating, and advocating for MS research in Australia. MS Research Australia was founded in 2004, and in a relatively short amount of time, they've invested $36 million in both national and international research collaborations that have successfully moved the ball down the field in finding better ways to diagnose, treat, and eventually cure multiple sclerosis. We'll talk with Matthew Miles about some of the amazing work that MS Research Australia has been doing, but first, there are a few other things that you should know about. At the American Academy of Neurology annual meeting, a team led by researchers from Johns Hopkins University presented a study that indicates that MS progresses more quickly in African Americans than in Caucasians in the United States. The research team compared brain lesion progression and retinal atrophy rates in African American and Caucasian MS patients, and they found that progression was significantly faster in both of these measures among African Americans. In fact, MRI scans demonstrated that whole brain, gray and white matter atrophy occurred twice as fast among African Americans than in Caucasians. The African American patient group also showed faster atrophy of the thalamus, a part of the brain linked to cognitive decline in MS. The results of this study would suggest the need for more aggressive treatment for African Americans who've been diagnosed with MS, and we'll include a link to the study in today's show notes. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, you might remember that 2 weeks ago, we talked about pediatric MS with one of the leading authorities on pediatric MS in the world, Dr. Emmanuel Vaubant. And during our conversation with Dr. Vaubant, we talked about the fact that the FDA had not yet approved a single MS medication specifically for use among children and adolescents who are living with multiple sclerosis. Well, at last week's American Academy of Neurology annual meeting, Dr. Vaubant was part of a research team that presented the results of a study that showed that Gilenya was effective in preventing the progression of disability and controlling disease activity in pediatric MS patients. The study compared Gilenya's safety and effectiveness with Avonex in children with relapsing remitting MS. The trial enrolled 215 MS patients between the ages of 10 and 18 in 25 different countries, and the initial data indicated that Gilenya reduced the frequency of MS flare-ups by 82% compared to Avonex. It also delayed brain atrophy and disability progression. Now, we mentioned this when it was first announced, but it bears repeating here. This past December 2017, the FDA named Gilenya a breakthrough therapy to treat children with relapsing remitting MS, and that means that Gilenya will be fast-tracked for FDA approval as a disease-modifying therapy for children and adolescents living with MS. From pediatric MS, let's move to the other end of the age spectrum. An analysis of 38 different clinical trials that was presented at the American Academy of Neurology annual meeting last week showed that the efficacy of MS disease-modifying drugs may decrease with age. The principal investigator for this study was Anne-Marie Wiederman of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke and the National Institute of Health. And the study indicated that there was no predicted benefit to continuing disease-modifying therapy for MS after the age of 53. The study concluded that MS disease progression can best be reduced by administering high-efficacy disease-modifying therapy during the early stages of the disease, and this conclusion is reflected in the American Academy of Neurology's new MS treatment guidelines that we started discussing on last week's podcast when they were announced. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that the study looked at the average MS patient taking an average course of disease-modifying treatment, and as they say, no one is exactly average, so your mileage may vary. Once again, take this information and use it as a springboard for discussion with your neurologist. The founder of the National MS Society, Sylvia Lowry, said, "It doesn't matter where in the world a cure is found, just so we find one." Well, I think it's important to remember that unraveling the mystery of MS is a global mission. One of the organizations making a difference in research designed to find better diagnostic tools and treatments that can one day lead us to a cure for MS is MS Research Australia. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, Dr. Matthew Miles, the Chief Executive Officer of MS Research Australia and the Vice Chair of the Executive Committee of the International Progressive MS Alliance. My guest this week is Dr. Matthew Miles, the Chief Executive Officer of MS Research Australia. And MS Research Australia is the largest nonprofit organization dedicated to funding, coordinating, and advocating for MS research in Australia. The organization was established in 2004, and its primary mission is to accelerate research toward the prevention, treatment, and ultimately a cure for MS. To that end, MS Research Australia has already invested over $36 million in major collaborative research platforms and investigator-led research projects. Prior to joining MS Research Australia, Dr. Miles was at the University of New South Wales, Australia, serving as the inaugural Director of the Office of Development and External Relations. He was a recipient of the Commonwealth Government Inspiring Australia Award in 2010. As well as the New South Wales State Government Science Discovery Award. In 2010, Dr. Miles also received the award for Outstanding Contribution to UNSW Medicine, and in 2013, he received honorary alumnus status from UNSW Medicine. In 2015, Dr. Miles was awarded the Harvard Club of Australia Fellowship, attending Harvard University as a not-for-profit fellow. He's a board member of the MS International Federation and serves as vice chair of the International Progressive MS Alliance's Executive Committee. Welcome to the podcast, Matthew.
Thanks, John. Great to be with you.
I know that MS Research Australia believes in maintaining a high level of accountability, so I'm wondering if you would share some of the major milestones and accomplishments that MS Research Australia has achieved.
Sure. We're actually quite modest in size. We're not a huge organisation, which keeps us quite nimble, and we're able to, for instance, raise funds in quite a nimble way. Meaning that one of our accomplishments is that a fundraising ratio, which is the costs that are incurred to raise money is quite good by national standards. So we raise money at about 25 cents in the dollar, and that's around 21 cents in the dollar for Kiss Goodbye to MS. So that means that the money that's raised with our fundraising programs, the majority of those funds actually goes directly to the mission, to the cause, and of course our cause, our solitary cause, is to find the cure and cures, better treatments, prevention for multiple sclerosis. We also receive a huge amount of pro bono or in-kind help, and over a 2-year window, it's pretty common for us to receive over $1 million Australian dollars in pro bono help from a variety of different corporate organisations and public relations organisations. Might range from just help with finding us a room for a facility or a conference, right up to complete pro bono public relations help for Kids Goodbye to MS, for example, which we do receive. So I think that's a great accomplishment, and also helps to keep our costs very, very low. Because we are small, we are also able to leverage our funding. So for every dollar that we give to research, we are able to leverage that grant. And that means researchers are able to find other sources of revenue to an average of about 5 to 1. So if we give a grant for 200,000 Australian dollars, the researcher in general can go off and get $1 million for their research projects, because our grants are easily leverageable, and they're Category A grants, which means they're very highly prestigious, competitive grants. When we have our small incubator grants, that actual leverage factor increases to 27 to 1. So the small incubator grants, the yearly grants we give, which are $25,000, on average, that researcher who receives one of our incubator grants can get $675,000 in additional funding for their research. So that's very, very exciting for us, meaning that our money that we do give goes a long way. And that was a good example of that was the world first discovery last year of the biomarker for the blood test, which we hope will be able to determine the different subtypes of MS, and that hopefully will just be a blood test in the future, whether you have relapsing or a form of progressive disease. That blood biomarker all stems from one small $15,000 incubator grant. So that shows the leverage that can be achieved from a fairly modest grant in what can be go on to be a world first discovery. So I think that, John, that's probably just a few of our areas that we're pretty proud of. There's some lots of others, but we try to measure everything we can so we can show people it's not just about the money that's raised, but the most important thing is what impact we have had with that money, with the donors' money, and what have we really achieved with those funds. So that's just a snapshot of some of those movements.
Well, I know in addition to maintaining a high level of accountability, collaboration is also a very important concept that you've embraced. And I know that you look at research collaboration on both a national and a global level. So I'm wondering if you can talk about some of your national research collaborations.
Yeah, sure. We've got a lot of national collaborations. The ones that have been the most recent, one that I'm particularly proud of is a collaboration, national collaboration with another charity in type 1 diabetes, and that was a great collaboration where we both approached a funder to look for any commonalities in the genetics of both type 1 diabetes and MS, and we just found anecdotally that there seemed to be some sort of relationship between that particular immunological disease and MS, and we funded a national project mutually together. Charities working together is not always something that the public sees a lot of, and we decided to do that together. We approached the Philanthropic Foundation together. We got the money, and then we employed the wonderful researcher together. We had, and that postdoctoral researcher had mentors from both type 1 diabetes and from MS. And in the year-long project, managed to find that genetic commonality between type 1 diabetes and MS that can then we can then go on and do further research to understand that. And that was just so very exciting because it was such a great project where we both reported on all the outcomes, and we were both just as proud as each other from a charitable point of view to be able to work together and help people with both forms of this autoimmune disease. So that was particularly exciting. That then has led on to another national collaborative called the Australian Immunological Alliance, which I'm lucky enough to chair at the moment. But it's 14 different charities, all in the same immunological space, from asthma, type 1 diabetes, as I mentioned, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, and other diseases like that, where we all get together and look at commonalities and similarities between ourselves and MS, and look for ways that we can work together, approach funders together, and look at opportunities for us to find out things about the disease that we never really would have the chance to had we not formed this sort of alliance. And it's just incredibly exciting to see how similar some things are, and how much work and potential to work together that there is. So I think that's a new concept, but it's particularly impressive. From a very much an existing national collaboration, we have a number of platforms. Probably two of the ones that we're best known for is one is our vitamin D clinical trial, to the world's largest of its type, to test whether vitamin D may be a useful preventative for people at risk of developing MS. And we've been running that clinical trial for a number of years across Australia and New Zealand, with many trial sites to test that hypothesis. And we should have some interim results probably by the end or mid to end of next year, where we can really start to understand what role vitamin D may play in the prevention of MS, and if so, what sort of dose may be suitable. So there's a lot of work to be done there. This of course is not fully proven, and the role is not fully known. And the vitamin D clinical trial is very, very important to that, and it does work seamlessly with other trials. Particularly, there's a large-scale trial in France going on, and I think this work is very synergistic or collaborative with the other work on vitamin D going on throughout the world, including in the United States. So that's very, very exciting for us and for the globe. And I guess the other one I would just mention would be our longitudinal study, which is just an actual study which even predates us. It predates MS Research Australia being inaugurated, and it's been going on for a long time, where a typical longitudinal study where people are followed with similar to same questions over a long period of time. And we're about to release some information as a program within that longitudinal study, and probably by June we'll be able to have some interim results on our economic impact report, which will really show Australians what are both the direct and indirect costs of MS. We know that previous study we did back in 2010-11 showed that the cost was about 1.3 billion Australian dollars per annum to the Australian people through direct and indirect costs associated with MS. And we'll have those new figures in a couple of months. We'll also have an update on our prevalence study, which will show how common MS is in Australia. We have a middling to high incidence of MS in Australia, as one would imagine, given our distance from the equator. And that, of course, is almost in the opposite of North America, is as you go further south in this part of the world, the chances of getting MS become higher. So our southernmost state called Tasmania, you have a 7 times more likelihood of getting MS than if you were born and bred in tropical North Queensland, our northernmost area. So we've got a very strong latitudinal gradient in Australia, being such a big country. So this sort of work is absolutely integral and important, and really was a lot of the bedrock of a lot of our knowledge about the environmental factors or confounders of MS. And a lot of this work really stemmed from a lot of Australian researchers funded by the American MS Society at that time. So very, very exciting work, but some great global collaborations, which has really led to increasing our knowledge about MS.
Well, when it comes to global research collaborations, I know that MS Research Australia plays an important role in the International Progressive MS Alliance, where you serve as Vice Chair of the Alliance's Executive Committee. Give us your perspective on the work that the Progressive MS Alliance is doing, and tell us how your role in the Alliance sort of fits within the overall vision of MS Research Australia.
Sure. Well, it really is it's a group activity from the Australian perspective. It, of course, not just me, our head of research, Dr. Lisa Melton, of course, Professor Bill Carroll is integral, and Trish Augustus in the communications area are all integral to the workings of the Alliance. And there's a lot of early mornings and late nights. I know that Trish was on a 5 a.m. teleconference this morning talking about comms, and the travel, of course, is severe when we do meet up. But why is it so important? Well, I just think it's one of the most important global collaborations that the world has ever seen in MS. I don't think there's anything like it. There certainly hasn't been anything to this degree of bringing the best minds together. I don't think there's been anything that's had the same infrastructure, or the same mission, or the same will, if you like, and the world coming together to know that people with progressive MS have not had the same benefits from the breakthroughs that relapsing patients have. And that sounds very obvious, but it is something that we all feel incredibly passionate about. And it's something that we now have the chance to do something about. And the International Progressive MS Alliance is the perfect avenue for that. And we all the managing members, but all 14 countries that are involved, 15 countries, including 16 different organizations. I think every one of us feels that we need to work together on progressive MS. It's a very, very complex problem, and we need to be asking ourselves those hard questions. Why haven't we seen those sort of benefits with progressive disease that we've seen in relapsing disease? What are the barriers to success? And if you look at what we're funding and what we're doing with the Alliance, everything now is really looking towards breaking down those barriers and dealing with the most complex parts of progressive disease, which we've just not been able to really impact on in the past. And, we are not going to accept that, and we are going to work together to break down all of those barriers so we can start to understand some of the fundamental issues behind progressive disease, and really find ways that we can deliver effective treatments, both affordable and accessible to people with progressive MS. So it works seamlessly with what MS Research Australia is about, and we've always been great collaborators in Australia. So this is not unusual, and we were very active in the International Genetics Consortium, which has been incredibly important to understand our genetic knowledge about MS, from knowing a couple of genes to now knowing over 200 genes that will determine one's susceptibility to MS. So the collaboration side of things is not unusual, but the Alliance is very unique, and we are absolutely determined to impact on the areas where we can uniquely help, where there is a unique place for the Alliance to come in and to make an impact on a particular part of progressive MS. And I think we are doing that extremely well, and the world is now galvanized against progressive MS. So it's incredibly exciting, and one of the best research alliances that I've ever seen, and I think it's inspiring.
Well, full disclosure, Matthew and I actually met. We know each other through our participation in the Progressive MS Alliance. He on the executive committee side, and I sit as a lay member on the scientific steering committee. And I just have to draw a big underscore under everything you just said. I don't think it could have been stated better. Obviously, I'm not just a cheerleader on the sideline. I have the honor of participating, but I couldn't agree more. And this gives me an opportunity to thank you for the leadership that you lend and the work that you and of course Dr. Melton, Professor Carroll, and your team provide to move the work of the Alliance forward. So thank you for that. Another collaborative program that MS Research Australia is involved in is a fundraising program that you've actually referred to a couple of times during our conversation today. It's called Kiss Goodbye to MS. The program's designed to raise money for MS research, and I believe that Kiss Goodbye to MS is active in 9 different countries now. Can you tell us a little more about the campaign?
Yep, sure. We founded and really put the campaign together here in Australia, and it was very, very exciting. And we really, at the start, we didn't know how it would go. It was very, very different to a lot of campaigns that were around at the time, but this did appear to be 2 things. I think one is it appealed greatly to a younger audience of MS and people who were recently diagnosed, or people who were sort of between, at the start, about the 25 to 45-year-old age group. Now, that over the last couple of years has extended. We're seeing a lot more younger people than that involved in Kiss Goodbye to MS, and, of course, we're seeing a lot more older people now involved. So we were very proud of its achievements, and it really was working beautifully as a platform of hope and of progress in MS. But it was also very, very perfect in a way to run digitally. So the campaign, as big as it is, for the most part, it's just run by one person, meaning that costs are low and you can really run the campaign as part of your social media platform. It's very, very popular on Facebook and Instagram and other social media platforms. And it's an example of DIY fundraising, so you can really do what you like with Kiss Goodbye to MS. And I do have to say now, John, it's in 15 different countries throughout the world, which is really, really exciting. And this came about as an approach from MSIF, the global federation, to ask whether they could lead a global rollout for Kiss Goodbye to MS to be their signature platform throughout the world. And we just felt really thrilled with that. And we just felt it was the right thing to do. It was very, very successful in Australia. We don't receive any other financial benefit or anything like that, but it was just really, really important that we wanted the rest of the world to have the same benefit that we were getting from Kiss Goodbye to MS, and that's what we've seen throughout the world with, obviously it's in the United States, the UK, Canada, Ireland, France, and we've just had the launch recently in the Netherlands, which was an extremely exciting, wonderful night which I've managed to attend because I was there with the Alliance meetings. And it was just incredibly exciting to see their take and every country in the world's take on Kiss Goodbye to MS and how different it is, how similar it is in some ways, but their nuances for how they are running their campaign in country. We've also just received notice that Egypt and Lebanon will be running Kiss Goodbye to MS, so I can't wait to see how that will be in Arabic to run that campaign. I know even places like India have been looking into what form they might be able to run a campaign. It'll be very, very different, of course, but how they might do some sort of pilot as well. So it's really a first of its kind. There's nothing like it raising money for MS in the world. And we're particularly proud of its achievements. And I think Kiss Goodbye to MS has been a very big part of us receiving the Telstra Charity of the Year last year. And we also did receive the New South Wales Business of the Year. I think we're the first charity to ever win a business award. And Kiss Goodbye to MS was a really big part of that. So we're really, really proud of what it's achieved. We're really proud that it's a low-cost platform, and it keeps on going from strength to strength. I think if we could see the world come together and run all of their Kiss Goodbye to MS programs, I know we're hoping for 18 countries involved next year. I just would be pretty confident of what we could achieve together globally if we could do that. I think it would be incredibly exciting to see the whole world come together and work together to solve MS. I think people with multiple sclerosis don't really care where breakthroughs come from. They just want breakthroughs and better treatments and preventatives, and of course, mild repair and curing the disease. They just want that to happen. And so I think once we put our heads together, we can achieve amazing things. And Kiss Goodbye to MS has been a perfect example of that.
It sounds absolutely amazing. So before I let you go, tell me, where can people go if they want to learn more about MS Research Australia or perhaps even make a donation?
Sure. Everything is on our website, which is www.msra.org. That's msra.org. And we've got a pretty comprehensive website, which also includes links to Kiss Goodbye to MS and all of those platforms and national collaborations and, of course, international collaborations. So everything's there on our website. where you can get more information on what we're doing and how we raise funds to keep on doing what we're doing.
Well, let me thank you for spending some time with us today, Matthew. In any kind of a long-term effort, great progress requires great vision and great leadership. And so thank you for the leadership you supply to the mission of solving multiple sclerosis.
Well, I think thank you, John, for yours as well. I mean, it's been so very, very important to have yourself and, of course, others as part of the Alliance and part of that leadership. That's a big part of the success of the global collaborative. So I think this is just a perfect example of people coming together and working together beautifully. And as I said, I think we'll all be amazed what we can achieve if we keep on doing that.
That's going to wrap up this edition of the RealTalk MS podcast. And if you like what you're hearing when you listen to us, I hope you'll take just a moment and head over to realtalkms.com/rating, that's RATING, where I invite you to leave a rating and review that'll appear in iTunes. That would be doing me a huge favor, so I thank you in advance for those of you who can take a moment to do that. And I think that actually does bring us to the end of this week's podcast. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.